my name is Christy Lutz, and I write technical content for Wacom. And this speech is the 2.0 version of a speech that I gave at the Portland Write the Docs in May. And that speech was based on a speech that I gave the year before when I talked about finding courage in technical documentation. And then I talked about that one of the scariest things about any of our work life is sharing your work and asking for feedback. And no matter what kind of documentarian you are, sharing your work and asking for feedback is a part of all of our jobs, even a part of all of our lives. And yet for something so fundamental, it can feel so painful. It can be really overwhelming and terrifying. You can feel like you don't even want to do it, like you won't even survive it. Well, you will survive because you're a documentarian. Feedback is your food. You take it in and it makes you stronger. Feedback became so much easier for me after I learned design critique guidelines from a UX designer that I worked with. She taught me the design critique guidelines were a set of rules for giving and getting feedback that make feedback easier. Essentially, how to ask for feedback, how to give feedback, and how to deal with feedback. And this is so important because it puts the emphasis on the goals of a project and not on criticism. And when I say project, I mean that at every level. I've used design critique guidelines when getting one user help topic reviewed, and I've used them when redesigning a support center. So they're very scalable and can really help make your feedback workflow easier. But before we start talking about design critique guidelines, I want to talk about what's good about feedback. Feedback reminds you how important you are, because without your work, there is nothing for feedback to base itself off of. Your work forms the base. And it's because of that base of your work that feedback can respond to something, move forward, and make your project stronger, all because of that feedback. Also, feedback leads to better working relationships, specifically ones based on trust and vulnerability. I was recently at a Write the Docs meetup in Portland, and afterwards someone came up to me and asked me how I connected and communicated with my team. I'm embedded in the engineering team at Wacom. And I told her that I admit that I don't know things every day. Because when I admit that I don't know things, what I'm saying is that I need feedback and I need help. But I'm also telling my teammates that they can tell me when they need feedback and when they need help. And when we're all talking about what we don't know and all sharing what we do, the team gets smarter and stronger because of feedback. And then in a story that's in the running for the most meta ever, when I submitted this proposal for this speech, I got some feedback on the title from the Write the Docs team. And through discussing that feedback, we actually came up with a much better title. So feedback works because it makes things better every time. So next I want to talk about what you need to do design critique guidelines. Who wants this one? Who wants, okay, you want this one? There you go. Sorry, my aim is bad. First, you need to identify the stakeholders, including you, because you are an important stakeholder in all of your work. And one of my favorite things about design critique guidelines is if you're doing the work and you're requesting the feedback and you're incorporating the feedback, then you are the owner of it. And as the owner, you are the problem solver, which means you get to figure out how that feedback makes your project better. Next, you need to figure out the goals of your project. Every project is a balance of goals and considerations. Where I work at Wacom, we translate our user help into 14 different languages, and that translation takes time. But that time and those translations are goals and considerations of all of our projects. Something that can really help you figure out that balance is if you write something that's normally called a problem statement, but I like to call a scope statement, where you start by talking about what kind of work you're sharing, and then you talk about the problems that that work will solve, and then you talk about what kind of feedback you need, and even more importantly, what kind of feedback you don't need. Because not all feedback is appropriate for your project at all times. You may be at a point of your project where you can take feedback on colors and page layouts, or you may be way beyond that. You know the timelines of your project, so be specific when you're asking for what you need and what you don't need. Next, write down some feedback guidelines. Feedback guidelines are an extension of your scope statement, but they're broader and they're for every project. And you can put whatever you want in them. You can pull things from this speech or you can completely make them up, as long as you illustrate how you like to receive feedback. At Wacom, since we translate, we don't use contractions because those don't translate well. But at my previous job, we did use contractions. So every once in a while I find them slipping into my work, and I usually catch them. But that could be one of my feedback guidelines. I could say, let me know if you see contractions in my work. So be specific about what you need from your reviewers in your feedback guidelines. And then finally, the last thing you need for design critique guidelines is the right mindset. After I gave this speech in May, I got some feedback from a colleague of mine named Maria Devoto, and she suggested I read an author named Peter Elbow, who writes about writing and about feedback. And there's a quote in one of his books that really sums up for me the mindset that you need to use design critique guidelines. And it is, feel like you don't need to please your reviewers, just use them. And what that means to me is that with design critique guidelines, everyone has a role to play and everyone has control over a part of the process. Specifically, reviewers are in control of how they feel when they review your work, and you are in control of the feedback you ask for and what you do with that feedback. Okay, so how do you start using design critique guidelines? Somebody wants this crown, I know you do. Don't be shy. Yay! Thank you! So you just start. You did a lot of work already. You wrote down a scope statement. You wrote down feedback guidelines. You have the right mindset. So share those things. Share your work and start gathering feedback. And during this time when you're gathering feedback, it's important to listen and take in as much as you can. One thing that will really help you with this is if you repeat back to your reviewer what you hear them saying, just slightly adjusted, to make sure there aren't any misunderstandings. Something else that can really help you at this time is if when you're hearing a review or some feedback, if you find yourself wanting to use the word but, try using the word and instead. It really opens up conversations and helps you get to the heart of the feedback while taking some pressure off of that feedback. Also remember at this point that you don't need to sell your work. You don't need to justify your intent because your reviewers are not judging you. They're not thinking, ugh, why do I have to tell her this? They're actually thinking, what is the best feedback I can give her? And they might even be thinking, is this feedback wrong? You're doing your job well just by listening well, so take in as much as you can. Okay, how do you get people involved? And first, someone needs to take this crown. Who wants it? Yay, you might have to run for it. Thank you. Design critique guidelines are very scalable. You can use them when you're sending an email, or you can throw a feedback party. When I worked at Jive Software and at Monsu Commerce, we threw thinking hat sessions when we were redesigning a support center and reorging some Docs landing pages. And what we did is we got a conference room and we hung up wireframes on the wall, and then we invited everybody, which sounds really overwhelming because when you invite everybody, everybody gives you feedback. But on the other hand, it's really exciting too, because when people give you feedback, they're invested in your success. So get as many people involved as you can. So we invited our reviewers to the conference room, and when everyone arrived, we gave everyone a role and a thinking hat, which everyone looked great in, and we said, please limit your feedback to your role. So maybe you were a black hat and could only give negative feedback, or maybe you were a red hat and could only give emotional feedback. And when we asked our reviewers to limit their feedback to their roles, we actually got much better feedback. The feedback we got from the Thinking Hat sessions radically improved both of those projects. So remember, when you limit the feedback that you ask for, you get better and more focused feedback. When I worked at Viewpoint Construction Service, we were working the user booth at our user conference, and we wanted to talk to the attendees about our user help. And if you've ever worked a user booth, you might know that if you say to someone, hey, do you want to talk about user help? You might get a polite decline. But if you say, hey, do you want to play with stickers? No one tells you no. So we had all of these great conversations with our attendees about our user help just by engaging with them, by giving them a sticker and saying, if you can say yes to any of these questions, put a sticker on that board. And we weren't trying to solve the mysteries of the documentation universe. We just had 3 simple questions. But because we engaged with them that way, we got the feedback on which of our features that our users liked, and if they didn't know about them before, they knew about them now. And you can use design critique guidelines anywhere and everywhere. You can hang something up by your desk or in the hallway and let your coworkers use the couple of minutes in between meetings or when they need a break to give you some feedback. If you have collaboration software at your work, like wikis, try working publicly. At every tech writing job I've ever had, I've had a public space where I work on my drafts called Here There Be Monsters. And because when I work publicly on my drafts, I feel like I have more control in the feedback process. But remember, if you work publicly, you might get public feedback. One of my favorite feedback givers of all time, a woman named Jenny Marks that I work with at Jive Software, she really used my work wikis to our benefit by always being ready with constructive criticism, which really saved me time. Also, remember your team when you're looking for feedback. I feel really lucky at Wacom because we have a part-time dedicated Docs tools resource. His name is Arthur Krebsbach, and he is basically a unicorn of the documentation universe. Because when there was an opening on the engineering team for someone to dedicate their time to Docs, he volunteered for it. So he's my natural go-to for documentation feedback. But even if you don't have an Arthur, use your team. Maybe in the couple of minutes at the beginning of a meeting, when you're still waiting for everyone to arrive. Just throw out a question. I was recently giving my daily report at a stand-up, and afterward I threw out a question that I needed an answer to. I wanted to know which term people preferred as the plural of stylus, styli or styluses. And after just a couple of minutes of lively conversation, one of my coworkers came up with an even better third option, stylus products. And so because I took up that time at a meeting, I got an answer I needed. So take up time at meetings because you're an important part of your team and you deserve that time. Okay, how do you give feedback? Who wants this one? Yeah. Oh, good catch. This list here was written by Judy Reeves, and if you can embody this list, then you, as a reviewer, are truly making yourself an ally to the writer, instead of putting yourself in the role of criticizer. And if you can embody this, then you are already feedback royalty. But basically, in summary, what this is saying is you're a person, so be a person. Human beings give really good feedback simply because they're human. You may be a SME for a project, but you also just might be a really good listener, or you might be someone who's never given feedback before. Remember that your role is very important to your review, and your job is important, but that you're a human being beyond that too, so embrace that. And related to that, everyone has to get feedback at some time, so give the kind of feedback you would want to receive. And if it helps, imagine that you're giving that feedback to your nephew, or your daughter, or your cat, and give the kind of feedback that you would want them to receive. And then this is the design critique guideline that I feel like everybody knows and yet everybody forgets. All of your reviews should begin with what's positive, because there's something good about everything you do, and there's something good about everything you review. So start all of your reviews with what's good about your reviewing, and then try to improve it too. And when you're reviewing something, ask as many questions as you can. Even if you feel like you understand it, ask questions. And even more importantly, pose your feedback in the form of a question. It really helps feedback sound more like a discussion and less like criticism. And then related to that, remember that the goal of the project is the goal of your feedback. So when you are a reviewer, you have one role at all times, and it is the most important role, whether you're in a thinking hat session or not. And it is as the defender of the goals of the project. So as the reviewer, it's your job to make sure that your review and the work itself supports the goals of the project. And something that can really help you with that is if you defend your feedback to yourself before you pass it over. So for each and every single piece of feedback, ask yourself, why am I giving this feedback, and how does it support the goals of the project? And be as specific as possible. The more specific that your review is, the more helpful it is. Okay, so how do you deal with feedback? Who wants this? Anybody in the back? Nobody in the back wants a crown. Yay! I'm going to toss it as far as I can. You come get it. You want to grab it? That was not that far. I want to start out this section by telling a story about a coworker of mine named Michael, who dealt with feedback in such an amazing way recently. At Wacom, we do a small QA on our releases before we send them over to the official QA, and it's called checklisting. And recently, I was the checklister for Michael. And this being my first time checklisting, I was, shall we say, thorough. And even though I handed over an overwhelming amount of feedback, you know what Michael said? He said he wanted me to be his checklister next time too, because he is feedback royalty. But what we can learn from Michael is that even when we're given a lot of feedback, it puts us in the position of problem solver, which means we get to take that feedback and we get to make our projects better because of it. I also want to tell a story about my sister Cheryl. She's in the audience here today. She was recently at the user conference for her company during a time when she was rewriting her user help. And she was worried about getting negative feedback about which topics she decided to write about first. So I suggested she take a tablet of paper with her, and if someone came up to her and said, "Hey, why aren't you writing about this?" she could immediately write that down. And that way the person giving feedback would feel validated and heard. Really, no matter what she did with that sheet of paper, she could turn around and immediately rip it to shreds. But more importantly, in writing it down, she had to consider it. And if she heard that topic a lot, it was going to move to the top of her list and she was going to write about it. And so that feedback was going to make her project stronger. So remember, the point of feedback is not to be praised, and it's not to avoid criticism. The point of feedback is the goals of the project. And then even though this is the design critique guideline that everyone forgets, there is something good about everything you do. So all of the reviews that you're getting on your work should begin with what's positive about your work. And if you're not hearing it from your reviewers, give it to yourself, because you are good at this. And here's a couple of tips and tricks you can use to build up your immunity when you know you're going to get some feedback. And the first one is to understand the situation of your reviewer. I was recently involved in writing some user help topics that were getting quite a bit of feedback from a specific product manager. And what I found out is that this project was important not only to that product manager, but also to the company as a whole, which is really exciting because it meant that that product manager thought that user help was an important part of an important project. So celebrate when you're getting a lot of feedback because it means your work is important, and understand the situation of your reviewer. The next thing you can try when you first get some feedback is a bit of redirection. So when you first get feedback, no matter what you think of it, whether you think it's amazing or you would never consider it, immediately start asking the reviewer about why they gave that feedback. It will help clear up any misunderstandings and help you get to the heart of the feedback while also taking some pressure off of that feedback. And then finally, take a break. When you first look at a piece of feedback, say to yourself, "I don't understand this yet," and grab some water, grab some food. I know that I'm always so much smarter after a walk. Distance really will give you clarity, and I promise you when you get back, that feedback will feel less painful. And then the number one thing that can help you deal with feedback, my favorite design critique guideline, is that you and your stakeholders own that feedback. Because you are not a documentation vending machine. Someone doesn't put a quarter in and out pops writing. You're a vital part of the process. And as a vital part of the process, you and your stakeholders own that feedback and can do whatever you want with it. You can ignore it. You can throw it away. You can pour rum all over it and light it on fire. You can do whatever you want with it. And when I say you can do whatever you want with it, I don't mean ignore it. I just mean believe that you have power in this process. Because you could light it on fire, couldn't you? It's just that you won't, because you're smarter and stronger than that, and you'll use that feedback to make your projects better. Okay, so how do you measure your results? Yeah, love that hand. Do you want to come and get it? Yeah. First, follow up on anything that you didn't understand from your first round, and if you need to, get some new people, some fresh faces involved in a second round of feedback. And then once you have everything clarified, you and your stakeholders should sit down and for each and every single piece of feedback, ask yourself, is it in scope and does it support the goals of the project? And you'll have to expect that for some of the feedback, the answer will be no. I think it's the natural instinct of some documentarians to say, oh, they're right and I'm wrong. To take feedback as definitive truth, because SME has the word expert in it. But not all feedback is appropriate for your project at all times. And you know your timelines and goals better than anyone else, so trust yourself. Also remember that feedback is a discussion. Feedback is not an opportunity for your coworkers to tell you you're wrong. It's actually a back and forth. So encourage that with your stakeholders by writing down a list of reasons for accepting or rejecting each piece of feedback, and save it so you'll have it to refer to later. Okay, how do you report your results once you've measured them? Somebody wants this, I know you do. Everyone looks great in these. Fantastic. Yay, thank you. First, appreciate your reviewers. They are so important to this process. Thank them and let them know what your next steps are going to be. And then remember, when you're reporting your results, it's not about winning. It's not about, I took your stuff and I didn't take yours and you were right and you were wrong. Frame your reporting of your results with respect to the goals. And then ultimately remember that the goals of all of our projects is helping people. And then also remember that you can give feedback to your reviewers in this process as well. When you're working on a feature or a project, you have a specific insight into how that feature or project is working. And so if a feature is taking a long time to write about, or if a project is taking a long time to work on, then you can give feedback on that feature or project. It's possible that that feature and project needs its own feedback. That's the circle of life for feedback. You're in a place of expertise where you can give feedback to your reviewers in the feedback process as well. And then something you might be concerned with while you're reporting your results is the feelings of your reviewers. But as you can see from this very scientific Venn diagram, nice and design critique have very little to do with each other. Be polite, yes, always. But being nice is not going to get you to the point of the feedback. Design critique guidelines teaches you to be honest because then you and your reviewers get the most out of the feedback. And related to that, it's not your goal to make everyone happy. So you don't have to report on every single piece of feedback. You don't have to say, oh, we accepted your feedback and here's why, and we rejected your feedback and here's why. Definitely have your reasons ready, and if someone wants to discuss, be willing to discuss with them. But you don't have to report on every single piece of feedback. Because the goal of the project is not to fix everything now. The goal is actually much smaller than that, and it's your job to stick to the goal. Also, projects are iterative, so this is not the end. Which on the one hand is really overwhelming because yes, you're going to write this user help topic again. You're going to look for docs tools again. But on the other hand, it's really liberating because that feedback is not dead and it has a chance to make your project stronger in the future. And then, because I know a lot of you will really take this to heart and try to figure out how design critique guidelines can make your feedback workflow easier, I want you to believe that you have real power in this process, in that you can teach design critique guidelines to your team. Because if you teach design critique guidelines to your team, feedback gets better for your whole team and ultimately for you. And even though feedback is overwhelming and terrifying, and it feels like you won't survive, you are brave just by asking for feedback. Because just by asking for feedback, you have already succeeded. Thank you.